And of course, we've looked at the problem of aging, the infirmities that come with it. We're now in the midst of what I think is one of the most complicated problems, emotions, and that is, of course, the problem of grief. The problem of grief. Now, this will probably take until next week to conclude this entire series. And I will say this, we do need some of your observations concerning how to help a heavy heart. When you're trying to help someone who is grieving, what do we do? What can we say? And so please be thinking about that. You don't have to jot down a lot of things, just give me one thing that we can use in that, because this is such a needed observation. We all need to be better equipped to deal with grief and to help others deal with grief. But we're looking at grief, and again, notice we did much of this last Wednesday night, the definition. We'll put part of what we set up there tonight from last week. Causes, we'll just mention them again very quickly. Examples, we'll have one slide and not belabor this point, but just notice what we've already considered. And then again, some verses. And we'll begin tonight really with some quotes. Quotes concerning grief. And then look at the 5 stages of grief. Psychologists have not only talked about 5 stages of grief, but we'll look also at what has been called the 3 seasons of grief. And so we'll look at that too. This is showing us what we go through when we deal with grief. And then, of course, we'll conclude with how to help a heavy heart. And emphasize that last statement, a heavy heart. We'll notice in a moment that from the Latin, that's exactly what grief means. Gravis, heavy. You remember what Jesus said in John 14 in verse 1, also in verse 27, let not your heart be troubled. Well, that's what we're talking about. When you talk about grief, you're talking about something that is heavy, something that troubles our heart. I love to put together John 12 in verse 27 with John 14 in verse 1. Remember, again, in John 14 and verse 1, that context begins, let not your heart be troubled. Back in John 12 and verse 27, Jesus said, my soul is troubled. What shall I say? Father, save me from this hour. It was for thy purpose I came to this hour. But I want you to notice, Jesus said, my soul is troubled. He knows what was awaiting him in Jerusalem, yet he continues to tell the disciples that's where we're going. He knew about that cup that he was about to drink, that cup of sorrow, that cup of suffering. He knew that he came as our Savior, our Redeemer. He knew ultimately what would happen is he would be crucified. And remember, this is why Peter said, no, Lord, and this is why Jesus said, get behind me, Satan. You're setting your interest on things of men, not of things of God. But again, Jesus knew, and that made his heart heavy. Remember in Matthew 26, if there's any way for this cup to pass from me, let it be so. But not my will, but yours be done. Talking to his Father. Father, if there's any way that this can pass, any way that man can be redeemed, man can be saved without me going through this crucifixion, let it happen that way. There was no other way. Jesus became obedient to death, even the death of the cross. Philippians 2 and verse 8. But this troubled his soul. And so the point is, Jesus' soul was troubled so that our heart doesn't need to be. We can cast our cares upon him, knowing that he cares for us. 1 Peter 5 and verse 7. Now, I fully understand that these things are easy to say when we're not going through the, quote, valley of the shadow of death. You remember Psalm 23 and verse 4? Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. For you, thou art with me. Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. And so the valley of the shadow of death, we could, really say this could be applied to grief, because that's what we're doing. We're going through that valley, and we're going through it really in a state of confusion, in a state of fog. We're dealing with anger. We're dealing sometimes with bitterness, with resentment, just so many emotions balled up into grief. And so, how to help a heavy heart? We all need to be prepared for grief as well as we can. This is not something that, of course, you understand when it's going to take place and understand fully how to deal with it. But we need to strengthen ourselves before we go through that valley of the shadow of death. And so the definition that we used last week, grief, is from the Latin word gravis, which means heavy. Grief is something that is heavy. It is burdensome to the human heart. It also means pain of mind, arising from any cause, sorrow, sadness. And so we want to emphasize, as we did last week, it's pain of mind. This is not so much physical pain. Well, notice, I believe grief can and does affect us physically, but ultimately, initially, usually, this is a pain of our mind, of our heart. Again, causes, this is not an exhaustive list, but prolonged sickness, tragic injury, lost job, business failure, family problems, children, divorce, death of loved ones. You never really know what people are going through. And you never really know, unless you're close to people, what they have come through. And so we need to be very careful as we deal with one another, just like Tom's lesson. Dysfunctional families, yes, in the physical sense, and also spiritually. Let's be a functional family, a congregation that does have the same concern for each other. 1 Corinthians 12 and verse 25. Now, the examples, first one, Genesis 6, God himself was grieved. In chapter 26 and verse 35, this is when Isaac and Rebekah are grieved. They're grieved at, again, Esau's choice for wives. 1 Samuel 1 and verse 16, Hannah is grieved. 1 Samuel 25 and verse 31, this is Abigail. She is trying to help David to make the right decision so that he will not face grief and grieve later. Again, let me go back. Job. Job dealt with grief. Psalm 31 and verse 9, David is dealing with grief. Proverbs 10 and verse 1, it's the mother in that context. Proverbs 17 and verse 25, it's the father. And in both cases, a foolish son causes a mother or a father grief. In Isaiah 53 and verse 3, Jesus, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. In Jeremiah 45 and verse 3, Baruch, again Jeremiah's scribe. Romans 9 and verse 2, Paul, the grief that he felt over his countrymen according to the flesh, the Jews. Some verses, I took out most of the verses, but here are just a few of the verses that we mentioned last week. Genesis 26 and verse 35, and they were a grief of mind to Isaac and Rebekah. Again, I wanted to keep that because a grief of mind, that's where grief strikes. Our mind, our heart. Biblically speaking, the heart, the Bible heart, is the mind. And so they were a grief of mind to Isaac and Rebekah. In Job 2 in verse 13, regarding his friends, notice, so they sat down with him. That's talking about the friends sitting down with Job. They sat down with him on the ground 7 days and 7 nights. No one spoke a word to him, for they saw that his grief was very great. Notice that. Very great grief is going on in the book of Job. Job has to encounter it. Job has to endure it. Job has to deal with it, and he does, pretty much by himself. Again, another one, in Psalm 31 and verse 9, we talked about David. Notice this, have mercy on me, O Lord, for I'm in trouble. Notice that trouble. My eye wastes away with grief. So trouble and grief are synonymous in this verse. Yes, my soul and my body. Now, we've emphasized grief typically, usually, is that pain of mind. But we said grief can also affect the body. And that's what we find here. It is soul, but also and my body. It's just like in Psalm 32, David's sin that he didn't repent of, it affected him physically. And so it affected his body. Notice in Isaiah 53 and verse 3, at least the first part of verse 3, he's despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. Jesus knew what grief was all about. As it says, he was acquainted with it. In Jeremiah 45 and verse 3, I want to mention this again because 6 words here tell us about grief. And notice what Barak says here. God says, you said. This is what God is telling Barak. He has heard what he has said. You said, woe is me now, for the Lord has added grief to my sorrow. I fainted in my sighing, and I find no rest. And so notice those 6 words, woe, grief, sorrow, fainted, sighing, no rest. That is the realm of grief. That's how low grief can take us. And so here, let's start with these quotes. Grief is a walk alone. Now, of course, there's a sense in which this is absolutely right. And I think we all know there is another sense in which, no, it doesn't have to be a walk alone. We can help in this. But look, in Galatians 6, turn with me to Galatians, the 6th chapter. I want us to read the first 5 verses of Galatians 6 because it's going to indicate, Paul is, that there are times, there are circumstances when we can bear one another's burdens. But then there are times when each man must bear his own load. And so grief is one of these things that fits in both of these categories. I can help you with your grief. You can help me with my grief. But ultimately, you can't take away all of my grief. Ultimately, I have to deal with grief myself. And so look what this says in Galatians 6, beginning in verse 1. Paul writes, brethren, if any man is overtaken in a trespass, you who are spiritual, restore such a one in a spirit of gentleness, considering yourself, lest you also be tempted. Bear one another's burdens and fulfill the law of Christ. And so notice in verse 1 and 2, it's talking about those burdens that we can help each other bear and should. And in so doing, we fulfill the law of Christ. This is what Jesus would have us to do. But look at verse 3 and following. It says, for if anyone thinks himself to be something when he's nothing, he deceives himself. But let each one examine his own work, and he will have rejoicing in himself alone and not in another, for each one shall bear his own load. And so each one shall bear his own load. This statement is right. It is true. We can contribute, we can help, but in the final analysis, again, grief is a walk alone. You can't be there every moment for the person. You can't get into that mind, that heart that is hurting. You can't relieve the pain. We have to deal with this ourselves. And so is there help? Absolutely. Not only with each other, but our God. He is a very present help in time of trouble. Psalm 46 and verse 1. But still, it's obvious that He doesn't simply remove the grief. We have to deal with it. We have to walk through that valley. And I think when we do it as we ought, we become stronger. And that's one of the positive things. If there's anything positive about grief, and there's not a lot, but if there is anything, that's one of the things. Grief, Satan would love grief to crush us. But if we will handle it as we should and as we ought, it not only will not crush us, but it will make us stronger individually. And it will make us better equipped now to help someone else who is struggling. And so the very thing that Satan would throw at us to hurt us is the very thing that we use to strengthen ourselves with. And so grief is a walk alone. Notice, grief does not change you, it reveals you. You know, now please understand when I say what kind of character do you have, I'm not saying those without character suffer from grief. We all do. But it is a test of sorts. What kind of faith do I have? Will my faith get me through grief? And as we've mentioned before on occasion, if my faith will not even get me through grief, how is that faith going to take me to heaven? How can it be strong enough? You know, the Bible talks about, "O ye of little faith." Jesus asked that of His own disciples. And it talks about a small faith, you know, but it also talks about great faith. Sometimes Jesus, encountering the Gentiles, would note in front of the Jews, you know, this person has a great faith as compared to many of them. And so grief doesn't change you, it reveals you. I like this quote. Look at this. Grief is not a disorder. You know, let's stop there for a moment. Don't think there's something wrong with you when you're going through grief and you don't understand it. You feel like you're caught up in a whirlwind. Again, grief is not a disorder, a disease, or a sign of weakness. It is an emotional, physical, and spiritual necessity, the price you pay for love. The only cure for grief is to grieve. Now, as simple as that sounds, you know, there's a commercial on it which, you know, Captain Obvious is called out. Oh, Captain Obvious. Well, this is Captain Obvious here. The only cure for grief is to grieve. But don't ever forget that. We'll talk in a moment. You can't avoid grief. I can't ignore grief. And if we do, we're never going to overcome in the sense of getting through this period of grief. And so again, the only cure for grief is to grieve. Grief is not the enemy. Grief can be one of our greatest teachers. Now, I don't think we view grief like that until we have come through it. You know, when we're going through grief, we don't want a teacher. We certainly don't want this teacher, grief. But having come through it, we understand that I have learned something. I've learned something about myself. I've learned something about life. I've learned something about the power of faith. I've learned something about my God. I've learned something about others. And so it can be one of our greatest teachers. I like this because if you've ever grieved deeply, then you understand what this is saying right here. Things to do today. Number 1, get up. Number 2, survive. Number 3, go back to bed. That's how debilitating grief can be at times. Just to get up and to survive through that day and then go back to bed. Notice again, it's a kind of tired that sleep can't fix. You know, you think, you know, when you're so worn out emotionally that you would think, well, I'll just stay in bed. It doesn't fix that, does it? It's that kind of tired. Sleep can't fix it. Grief is work. Avoiding grief is even more work. Again, remember what we already mentioned? The only way to get through grief is to grieve. And so grief is work. Avoiding grief is more work. It's better to feel pain than nothing at all. And I think sometimes when we're grieving, there may be that numbness where we don't feel much at all emotionally. But again, it's better to feel pain. It's better to grieve than to feel nothing at all. Sometimes all you can do is lie in bed and hope to fall asleep before you fall apart. Now, again, here's a wise observation here. This is what grief causes us to do. We're not ourselves. We don't feel like we're in control of much. Certainly not the circumstances that have brought the grief, and sometimes not even our own feelings. We just are confused. We're numb. And so you hope to fall asleep before you fall apart. Sometimes it's okay if the only thing you did today was breathe. Just get through this day with the grief that you're dealing with. It's perfectly okay to admit you're not okay. Sometimes memories sneak out of my eyes and roll down my cheeks. What cannot be said will be wept. Again, grief, I've learned, is really just love. It's all the love you want to give but cannot. Grief is just love with no place to go. Now, those who have lost loved ones, they understand this. Grief is love with no place to go. The very one you wanted to go to and to talk, they're no longer there. I mentioned this, but if you want to look at personification, and I'm going to say a beautiful view of personification, even though it is harsh, but it gets the point across. Read Lamentations, the first chapter, and God personifies the loneliness that Jerusalem is going through. It used to be a city full of people, but now it's no longer. And nobody is coming to the feasts. It's in disrepair. It's been crushed by the Chaldeans, by the Babylonians. And so how do you depict loneliness? God chooses a widow that sits weeping in the night. That's loneliness. And again, that's probably the most significant cause of grief that there is. Irving Berlin said, "The song is ended, but the melody lingers on." And so, yes, someone's gone, but their memory is still there. The melody is ended, but the song is ended, but the melody lingers on. And I love knowing Irving Berlin and of course his occupation. What a great depiction of grief. Now, the 5 stages of grief. Let me mention this. If you want a book that will give you some information concerning these 5 stages, years ago I ran across a book entitled Happiness is a Choice, and it was by Menrith and Myers. These 2 psychologists used to work together years ago. I guess they broke apart, and they're both still working. But anyway, this is a pretty good book. And everything that I read in this book, there was only one little paragraph wherein they get into some theological issues, and they even admit that we are not, quote unquote, theologians. They're not preachers. Well, they prove that because that little portion is wrong. But other than that, everything that they said was very biblical. And so this is the first time I read about the 5 stages of grief. And notice this quote before we mention these 5 stages. Someone has said the 5 stages of grief are tools to help us frame and identify what we may be feeling. But they are not stops on some linear timeline in grief. Not everyone goes through all of them or in a prescribed order. So again, these are tools. This can be used as a quote guideline, but don't think you can say, okay, I need to deal with this first one and I'll spend X amount of time here, and then I'll move to the second one and I'll spend some time here, and we'll go on to 3 and all the way through 5, and then, okay, my grieving process is over. You know, in everything that I've read, grief lasts from 3 to 6 months, and that's concerning those things that are not as significant, but a significant loss. It can last 1 to 3 years, and I think we all understand that even more than that, but that's what the experts are telling us. 3 to 6 months. That's the low end of the totem pole. 1 to 3 years with a significant loss. And really the grief can continue beyond that. But hopefully by that time we are back in life. We are invested once again in life. Grief has not paralyzed us. Grief has not crippled us. And so notice the first stage is denial. This is when we say what has happened did not happen. We just flat out say, no, I'm not going to recognize it. I'm not going to acknowledge it. I'm not going to admit it. We know, and I think sometimes we know it as fact, but we want it to be fiction. And so we deny, okay? Whatever has caused the grief. We're in a state of denial. And you know, sometimes shock is a part of this stage. And shock at times is good for us. It's a numbing agent where we don't feel the whole impact of grief all at once. But again, denial. Most people do not stay long at all in this stage. The second stage is anger turned outward. And this is when now we become enraged, angry, and we're angry at other people. We're angry, let's say, at the nurses because they didn't do more. They could have done something. We're angry at the doctor. We're angry at the surgeon. We're angry at other family members. We're angry at those who still are living a quote-unquote happy life. Don't they see my grief and what nerve they have to just go on as if nothing has ever happened? And so, again, anger turned outward. Sometimes people become angry at God. Why didn't you stop this? Why did you allow this? You remember, anger in and of itself is not wrong. Anger in and of itself is not sin. But anger is one of those emotions. It's so volatile that it can lead us to sin if we don't get a grip on it. Remember Ephesians 4 and verse 26, be angry, sin not. Do not let the sun go down upon your wrath. And then verse 27, neither give place to the devil. And so Paul tells us you can be angry. It's okay to be angry. But don't be so angry it causes you to sin. Paul, how can I deal with anger again, since we know what a strong emotion this is? How can I deal with it to where I will not sin? Well, he says, don't let the sun go down upon your wrath. Whatever has made you angry, whatever has made you upset, whoever has done this, get it reconciled before the next day. You go and you talk to your friend. You go and you talk to your brother, your sister. You get it handled. And the point again is, if we don't, then we're letting Satan use anger in our lives. We're giving him a place through that anger that we haven't resolved. And let me tell you something. If you look at our society, Satan knows how to use anger with those who will not deal with it, those who will not diffuse the anger that they feel. Oh, Satan, you give him room with anger, And it's not a pretty sight. Just, again, look at the casualties in our own society. Anger turned inward, the third stage. And this is when we're pretty much through being angry at everyone else. But now we're turning the anger at ourselves. And again, now I should have done more. I should have been there. And so the same thing we were doing for others, now we're blaming and accusing self. You know, if you stay in 2 and 3 too long, this is certainly going to lead you to depression. And again, even further and further and further. I love the verse in Psalm 27 and verse 3. David said, I would have despaired unless I had believed that I would see the goodness of God in the land of the living. And so David acknowledges that what he is going through, it could have led him to despair. But it didn't, because he held on to this belief, I will see the goodness of God in the land of the living. And I think the point is pretty clear. Tomorrow's going to be better. If I can just make it through the day. Again, remember those quotes? Get up, survive, go back to sleep. Just, if the only thing you've done today is breathe, that's okay. You get through this day. Tomorrow's going to be better because of our God and His goodness. Again, look at number 4, genuine grief. And obviously, this is the most important stage. This is when we are not denying what has happened. We have handled that anger. We have diffused it. And we are just genuinely now grieving. Again, you know, grief, as we've said, it's not a disorder. It's not a disease. It's not a sign of weakness. It is an emotional, a spiritual, a physical necessity. God has created us to where we can grieve. John 11 and verse 35, Jesus wept. You remember at the graveside of Lazarus, his friend, he wept. He was grieving. Paul tells his brethren in 1 Thessalonians 4 in verse 13, I don't want you to be uninformed, brethren, about those who are asleep, that you may not grieve as do the rest who have no hope. Now, it's important to note in 1 Thessalonians 4 and verse 13, Paul is not issuing a prohibition on grief. Paul is not saying don't grieve. That's not his point. He says that you may not grieve as do the rest who have no hope. You're not going to grieve like this world. He's talking about those who have gone on before us. And if you look at 1 Thessalonians 4, he's talking about those within Christ. They were wondering, we know that Jesus is going to come again, but these brethren fell asleep. They died before Jesus came, and is that going to hurt their chances of being with Him? And Paul's point is no. They're going to be raised first. And so, again, do not grieve as do the rest who have no hope. Don't grieve for them. Don't sorrow for them. Those who died in Christ, don't grieve for them like you would someone who died outside of Christ. Because these individuals, remember Revelation 14:13, blessed are the dead who die in the Lord. They'll rest from their labors. Their works follow after them. And so, genuine grief. And then the last stage, of course, is resolution. Resolution. This is when we've worked through the first 4 stages, and now the zeal and the zest and the joy of life becomes, it starts coming back into our life, okay? And we can turn back to life again. Let me read you the words of a song. I wrote them down and wasn't sure what this song was, the title of it. Julie said it's When My Love for Christ Grows Weak. And I trust her knowledge on songs. But there's a phrase, there's a stanza, and it says this: "Then to life I turn again, learning all the worth of pain, learning all the might that lies in a full self-sacrifice." But do you see that? Then to life I turn again. That's what resolution is. We have been grieving, but again, no longer. We understand that we have to turn back to life. Let me read a quote here. John Keats, he wrote, no more will I count over, link by link, my chain of grief." And that's really what we're talking about. When we understand that, I have grieved, and this process has helped me deal with my loss, but now I need to get back to life. There's a great context in the Bible. Write down 2 Samuel, the 12th chapter, and I believe it's in about verse 15 through about verse 23, and this is David. Remember, he is mourning because the child born to him in Bathsheba is sick. And so he is mourning. He will not take a food. He will not do anything. He's on his bed, and they're worried about him. And then they get word that the child has died. And so they are whispering to each other. And David hears and sees them whispering, and so he asks the question, "Is the child dead?" And they say, "Yes, yes, he is." And to their surprise, David gets up, and he washes himself, and he worships, and he allows them to bring food, and he partakes of food, and this confuses them, and they want to know, well, what's happening here? When the child was still living, you were, grieving. You wouldn't do these things, and now the child is dead. And David says, I can go to him, but he will not come to me. So he's saying, there's nothing more I can do. I can't bring the child back. I will go to him, but he will not come to me. And so that's resolution. When we have worked through the grief and now are resolved to get back to life. Now, look at this. 3 seasons of grief. Now, I just recently started reading a book. I've been almost through it. And it's a book entitled My Companion Through Grief. And the author of the book is Gary Kinnaman. Gary Kinnaman. And of course, at one point in the book, he's talking about the title, and he's talking about his book is supposedly to be viewed as My Companion Through Grief. Well, the book is pretty good. I just don't agree with that. No, we've got a better companion than that book. We have God's book, and even more than that, we have the author of the book. We have God himself. Now, I'm not minimizing the power of the Word, but sometimes people say, well, what got you through? What Bible verse got you through this? And we do know that the Bible is powerful because it's inspired of God. And when you read the Bible, God is speaking. And we know what happens when God speaks. He spoke and the world was created. Jesus, he calmed the sea with a word. And so we're not denying the power of the Word. Yes, it helps us. But what I'm saying is the reason it does help us is because of the God behind the Bible. Because of Him. We mentioned Psalm 46 in verse 1. Again, God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in time of trouble. And so my companion through grief, let it always be your God. And yes, let it always be His Word. But always make that separation. It's not just the Word by itself. The only reason this book is so powerful is because it is inspired. It's God-breathed. And so our companion through grief is God Himself. Now, here's what I want you to think of. We'll come back to this next Wednesday night, Lord willing. But we're going to talk about season 1, and they call it acute pain. This is intense pain. This is serious pain. Acute pain. Season 2, dull pain. And then season 3 is healing. And so we'll talk about this next week. I have some more quotes, and then we'll start getting into how to help a heavy heart. So having said that, please write down your quote-unquote help. How do you help someone who's grieving? Let me tell you something. We need help when we are grieving. I need it. You need it. And so what do we do? Just write down one thing that we can do to help that grieving heart. And again, thank you for your presence tonight. Thank you for your attention, for listening. And as Tom said, let's think about one thing we can do this week. Well, we can help someone. Look for someone who's going through some grief in their life, who's grieving, and help bear that burden. No, you can't take it all upon yourself, but you can bear a part of it. And so let's do that and fulfill the law of Christ. Thank you.